looking forward to presenting my paper and answering your questions. And thanks to all of you who decided to come and listen to my talk. So I'm Matthias van den Heuvel, a PhD student here at the EPFL. And I'm going to present a paper that I'm doing in collaboration with Gaëtan de Rassenfos, an assistant professor here at the EPFL. So our paper is Certification on Cash Price, the Heterogeneous Effect of Venture Competitions. And as you can expect, we are interested in the effect of venture competition, but not only that, we're interested in knowing why and how venture competition can be useful. So first, you might not be familiar with what venture competition is, so let me quickly tell you what it is. They are events in which a number of startups compete through normal stages in the hopes of receiving some type of reward. It can be a cash prize, it can be receiving mentoring from a famous entrepreneur, or it can be that participating in the competition offers some certification of their quality. So venture competition are a relatively new phenomenon, but they've already produced several famous alumni. In the United States, for example, startups or companies like Pinterest, Udemy, or Yammer have all won a venture competition. And in Switzerland, it's the same. MindMaze, which is a neuroscience startup, which was the first Swiss unicorn, participated in VentureKick, which is the Swiss leading venture competition. Or you can think of Climeworks, which is today one of the world's leading direct air carbon capture company. Climeworks also participated in one VentureKick. So what do we know about venture competitions? So they're part of a broader phenomenon of new intermediaries. You can think of accelerators, incubators, or crowdfunding that have emerged in the past 2 decades to provide support and finance to early stage startups. And so the phenomenon is quite new, therefore the research on it is also quite new. Nonetheless, previous research has shown that venture competition are useful for participating a startup. However, and this is where we can come in when there's space for our paper, there is no consensus yet on exactly why venture competition have an impact on startups' future success. On the one hand, you have some papers that argue that venture competition are useful because of the cash price effect. Indeed, competition usually supply capital to winning startups at a stage where acquiring such capital can be a bit challenging. Other papers say that the main reason why competition are useful is because of the certification effect. Indeed, competitions provide valuable information about a startup's value and potential to both entrepreneurs and investors. Using this information, the entrepreneurs and investors can kind of update their estimation of the probabilities, the startup's probability of success. How do we aim to contribute to this literature? So previous papers have shown how venture competition are useful to startups. In some cases, they seem to alleviate some capital constraints. In some other cases, they seem to alleviate some of the information friction in early stage startups. What we aim to do is to develop a more general understanding of the effect of venture competition. In particular, we want to provide a better explanation of the role of the certification and cash price. So what is our research question? It is, what is the impact of the cash price and certification on startups' business success? And second, the second part of the analysis is this impact homogeneous across technology types, or do we see some technology types, some startups benefiting more or less from these two effects? And so throughout the whole presentation, we try to differentiate between, on the one side, the impact of the cash price and certification on the survival status of the startup, meaning whether it's alive or not. And we argue that because shutting down or pursuing a venture is mostly the entrepreneur's decision, looking at the survival status provides us a bit of insight into the impact of the cash price and certification on the entrepreneur's decision making. On the other side, we also look at another measure of business success, which is the funding and the probability that a startup will secure funding after the competition. And we argue that because investing is mostly a decision that depends on investors, looking at the impact of cash price and certification on the funding variable provides us a bit more insight into how they impact investors' decision making. So in the paper, we also develop a toy model to answer these questions. Here, to save some time, we will skip the model, but we will still use the model's predictions and insights to kind of help us in the interpretation of our results. So a quick preview of our results. We find that indeed venture competition can have a significant impact on startups' business success. And what we find is that this effect is concentrated in the first stage of the competition where most of the certification happen. What we also find is that venture competition have a different effect depending on the startup's technology. First, the certification seems to be more useful to startups in technologies that judges are good at evaluating. In our case, more the science-based startups. And second, the cash price effect seems to be limited to helping startups with lower running costs survive a little longer. So, how do we aim to answer this question? So we use data on VentureKick. VentureKick is a venture competition based in Switzerland that has already granted more than $29 million, or Swiss francs, they're pretty much equal in cash prices, and they've been certifying participating startups' quality since 2007. As I've shown you in the earlier slides, many of the most successful Swiss startups have participated in the competition. This competition is structured as a 3-stage, 9-month contest that is open several times a year to a new group of 8 startups. I will go over this structure a bit more later in the paper because we use it to kind of tease out the certification and cash price effect. Finally, the competition focuses on very early stages ventures, and that's important. To participate, startups cannot yet have been incorporated, and they cannot yet have received professional funding. So they've not been scrutinized by professional investors. And finally, the competition is open to all industries. And to kind of give you an idea of what type of startup participate in VentureKick and therefore populate our sample, here is the distribution. And what's good is you can see that on the left in yellow, the more ICT-based startups, software and internet mobile represent half the sample. And on the right, the more science-based startups, meaning medtech, nanotech, biotech, these type of startups represent the other half of the sample. So we later use those two subgroups to kind of tease out the heterogeneity effect. So what data do we have exactly? So VentureKick has provided us with anonymized data on its competition and on 987 startups that have participated in a total of 305 rounds of competition over the years 2008 to 2017. So what data exactly do we have? We have data on the startup's characteristics. So this means that we know the industry, if it has any link with a particular university, the gender of the founder, the year of the founding, and things like this. We also have detailed competition and grading data. So we have the grades given by all the judges to all the startups in all the stages. So this means a lot of grades. And we also know exactly the order in which the startup went through the competition. Finally, and that's one of the strengths of this paper, we have yearly measures of business success, 2 to 8 years after the competition. So as I said before, we have one, the first one is the survival status, where the startup is alive X years after the competition. And the second one is whether and how much did a startup secure in terms of financing after the competition. Both of those were collected, both of those data were collected manually, but under our close supervision by VentureKick, looking at things like Crunchbase, LinkedIn, Facebook, the Commerce Registry, the startup website, etc., etc. We also have patenting activity data, but we only use it for descriptive purposes. So finally, before we delve into the econometrics, I want to show you how the startups in our sample tend to perform after the competition. So here you see the share of startups that are still alive 2 to 8 years after the competition, depending on how far they went in the competition. At the top, you see the winners of the competition. For example, after 6 years, 90% of them are still alive. If you compare them to the startup that lost in the first stage, so lost directly, those startups, only 30% of them are still alive after 6 years. So what we see is that winners tend to perform better after the competition. But this doesn't tell us much about the treatment, the causal effect of the competition. To kind of estimate and capture this treatment effect, we need to look into our econometric framework. So first, I've been telling you about this cash price effect and this certification effect, but certification is a bit of an intangible. So how do we capture the certification effect? What we do is we use the competition's multi-stage structure. So I'll quickly go over the structure to make you understand what we do. So in the first stage, 8 startups pitch their business idea in front of a group of around, on average, 9 juries. Each of the jury judge the startup on 11 different criteria, and they give a grade for each of those characteristical criteria. The 4 best startups are selected. They receive 10,000 francs. An online article and a tweet is written about the success, and they're allowed to put on their website an award that tells, oh, we are supported by VentureKick. 3 months later, those 4 startups present their business case in the exact same setting, and the 2 best startups receive 20,000 francs, and an online article and tweet is written about the success. This time, there's no more award, neither in stage 3. It's the same one. Whether you're in stage 1, 2, or 3 on your website, you can put the same award. Finally, 6 months later, the remaining 2 startups compete for the final prize of 100,000 Swiss francs, or $100,000, and the winner also receives once more like an online publicity. So one last thing is, after all of these stages, whether the startup lost or won, they receive a feedback from the competition, which tell them all the comments and doubts that the jury had about the startup's potential and value, and it also gives them their average grade. So we argue that we can use these stages to tease out certification and cash price effect. First, we use stage 1 to capture the certification effect. Why can we do that? Why are we able to do that? So we argue that stage 1 plays a crucial certifying role for both entrepreneurs and investors. You have to remember that the startups that participate in stage 1 have never been scrutinized by professional investors, and they've certainly never received feedback from professional entrepreneurs or investors. So for entrepreneurs, this is the first time that an expert or a team of experts assess their potential and tells them what they think. They might tell them, oh, your idea is not that good, or we think this idea is good. And this might have a very important certifying role for the entrepreneurs. On the other side, for investors, the awards and the articles and the tweet are usually the first credible signal of startup quality to which those investors have access. So we argue stage 1 plays a very important certification role. Stage 3, on the other hand, we argue captures the cash price effect. Why? Because it's primarily about winning the $100,000 cash prize. And we argue that there, the certification effect is much less important. Why? If you look at the entrepreneur's perspective, in stage 3, they will have received positive feedback in stages 1 and 2. So if they receive positive feedback after stage 3 or a negative one, it will not push them to adjust significantly how they view their startup and the startup's probability of success. For investors, it's the same. Winning stage 3 adds one more online presence on the internet, but they've already, the startup's credibility and legitimacy has already been established in previous stages. So we use stage 3 mostly for the cash price effect. So you might wonder, so what do we do with stage 2? As you can see here in the previous slide, it does not have any specificities. It's neither completely about the cash prize, it's neither completely about certification. So we don't attribute any particular effect to stage 2. We still estimate its effect, but we don't attribute any particular effect. A second thing that I need to share with you is that I need to convince you rather, is that as you already know, when you try to evaluate the impact of a program, you tend to run into the issue of treatment heterogeneity. So to account for the fact that winners are have both won the competition, but they're also of higher quality, we use the judge's grade to account and control for this unobserved startup quality. We argue that we can do this because, as you can see on the right, there is a very strong and positive relationship between the grades that are given in stage 1 and the future success of the startup, the probability that the startups will be able to secure funding after 2 years. So what we're saying is that judges' grades are a very good predictor of future success. In the paper, what we do is that we aggregate the 11 grades given to startup into a single measure of startup quality using a principal component analysis. One quick thing is that what we observe and what we will use later on to provide variation in the heterogeneity analysis is that judges seems to be better at identifying the best science startup than they are at identifying the best or evaluating the quality of ICT startups. This is in line with previous findings in the literature. And even though we don't really aim to explain why it's the case, one possible explanation is that the components of success of a science-based startups can be more objectively assessed. It depends maybe on the technology, whether it works, its cost, etc. Whereas maybe ICT success depends more on things that are more subjective. Market demand, will people want it or not? It's a bit harder to objectively assess. So before we delve into the results, how do we go about identifying the effect? First, we use equation 1 there, which is an OLS model in which we regress either survival or funding variable on winning the stage, our treatment effect, the startup quality that we measure with the grades, and we control for the year, competition, group, industry, and university. We can use the same equation to capture and estimate the treatment effect of stages 1, 2, and 3. When we want to look at the impact of the competition on 2 subgroups, ICT and science-based, then we use equation 2, where we introduce interaction terms that allows the effect, the treatment effect, to differ between those 2 subgroups, and as well as the grades, the impact of the grades to differ between those 2 groups. So let's delve into the results. Remember, our first question was, why are venture competition useful? Is it because of the cash prize or the certification or both? And so let's look at our first results. There's a lot of information on this slide, so I will walk you through it. So here first, on the top panel, you see the effect of winning stage 1. On the second panel, at the bottom, in the middle, you see the effect of winning stage 2. And finally, at the bottom, you see the treatment effect of stage 3. And so what you see is that if you don't control for startup quality, then all the stages have a significant positive effect. However, once you control for treatment heterogeneity, control for startup quality, then stages 2 and 3 seems to have no more impact on startups' future survival, whereas stage 1 does. Winning stage 1 increases the probability that a startup will be alive 2 to 4 years after the competition by 22 percentage points. Now, if we look at funding outcomes, whether it receives funding within 2 years or how many rounds of funding it managed to secure in the first 2 years, we see that once more, stages 2 and 3 have no impact, and only stage 1 seems to have an impact on all the measures of startup business success. And so what we argue is that these results tell us that what matters in a venture competition is the certification effect. Going a bit further, we want to understand a bit more what is going on with the certification. Is the certification impacting winners? Is it kind of convincing or like confirming to the winners that their startup is of high quality? Is it a positive effect on the winner? Or is it more a negative effect on the loser, telling the loser or certifying that the loser is not of that high quality? Usually it's pretty hard to know that, because the studies that do this type of venture competition analysis, we only have data on the competition, the startups that participate. We don't have data on the quality and outcome of startups that did not participate. So what we do here to kind of still try to estimate whether it's a negative or positive effect, where the effect comes from, what we do is we do a more descriptive analysis. So first, let's separate it in two things. For the more finance and investor related outcome, we argue that it can only be a positive certification. Why is that so? It can only be that winning stage one improves the funding prospects of the winners. Why is that so? Because the losers, the fact that they lost in stage one is never made public. So for the outside investors, they have no way to know whether a startup lost in the competition or never participated. So for the funding variable, it seems that it's mostly a positive certification. However, when we look at the impact of certification on the entrepreneurs, here it could be either. It could be that the certification, the positive feedback tells the startup, oh, you should double down on your project, it's amazing, go ahead. Or it could be the opposite. It could be that it tells losers in stage one, we don't think that your project is worth investing that much time and effort into it. The effect can come from both sides. So how we go about trying to estimate where it comes from is that we look at the average startup survival rate in Switzerland since 2013. On the graph on the right there, it's the gray line. And what we do is that we take the average participant in our competition and we predict its probability of being alive after the competition, whether it wins the competition or whether it loses the competition. And what we can see is that the average participant, if it wins the competition, after 2 years, it has pretty much the same predicted survival rate than the average startup in Switzerland. So the effect might not come so much by a positive effect on the winners. However, when you look at the predicted survival rate of the average participant, if it loses stage one, what you see is that its predicted survival rate is much lower than the average survival rate in Switzerland. So this is descriptive evidence, but it points out that actually what is going on and why we find a positive effect of stage one is because it pushes the startup that lose in stage one to maybe terminate or shut down their venture, their low quality venture, before they invest too much time and effort into it. The second part of our question is whether there's a sector related impact for the certification and cash price. And so to test the heterogeneity of our results, we separate our data into two technology subgroups who differ in two key characteristics. So those two subgroups are science-based and ICT. So as I've told you before, there's variation in the ability of judges to estimate science-based startup quality versus ICT. They're very good at evaluating the quality of science-based startup. They're a bit less good at evaluating objectively the quality of ICT startups. A second aspect in which those two subgroups differ is that science-based startups tend to have higher running costs than ICT. So this ICT's lower running cost means that maybe they'll be able to benefit from the cash price effect. So how do we go about estimating that? Here I use more of a visual representation. So each of those points are the treatment effect in the equation 2 before. On the left panel, you see the treatment effect of winning stage 1, 2, and 3 on the survival rate of science-based startup. And on the right panel, you see the treatment effect of winning stages 1, 2, and 3 on the survival rate of ICT startups. And so, and the light blue is the 99% confidence interval. So what we see here is that for science-based startup, it's only and very clearly stage 1 that has an impact on their future survival. So stages 2 and 3 seems to have no impact. And now, and that's what's interesting, is that for ICT startups, winning stage 1, so the certification stage, does not seem to have an impact on startup survival. Stage 2 neither, but now stage 3 has an effect on receiving the cash prize, seems to have an effect on startup survival rate. Now, if we look more at the funding part of the outcome, we see that once more, for science-based on the left, the winning stage 1 is the only stage. So the certification is the only stage that matters and that will have a causal impact on their probability of securing funding after the competition. On the right, for ICT startup now, none of the stage seem to have any impact. The certification does not improve the probability of securing funding, and the cash prize neither. So what this tells us is that venture kick certification of the science-based startups seem to help both entrepreneurs and investors make better informed decisions about investing or continuing a startup's venture. On the other side, for ICT startups, the certification seems to have no effect, neither on entrepreneurs. It doesn't impact whether they would pursue or not their venture. It has no effect on the probability that they will manage to get funding. However, the cash prize has an effect. It has no effect on investors. It's not because the startup received cash prize that they will want to invest more into it, but it has an effect on the startup survival rate. And so this could be because the lower cost allow them to survive a bit on this cash price, and this will have an effect on the survival rate. But if this is the case, then the effect should only be short-term. The cash price will not change ICT startups' fundamental value. And so this is where having access to yearly outcome data, so in multiple years after the competition, is very useful. So here we compare on the left the effect for science-based startup of winning stage 1. So you can see that for science-based startup, the certification effect of winning stage 1 is consistent through 2 to 6 years after the competition. On the other hand, on the right, for ICT startups, the effect of winning the third stage, so winning the cash prize, seemed to only be positive and significant 2 to 3 years after the competition. And after that, it has no more impact. It doesn't have any impact on their survival rate. So this is consistent with the idea that the cash prize effect on ICT startup is to allow them to survive a bit longer, because 100,000 francs allows them to survive. They have lower running costs and they can live on the cash prize. But then once the cash prize runs out, having won the cash prize has no effect on either the survival or their probability of securing funding. So what are the implications? So what are the answers to our questions? The first one is that it seems that in a well-developed financial system, venture competitions are useful mainly because they provide an informative certification of quality. It could very well be that in other contexts where the cash prize is the only source of financing, then the cash prize could be more important. But in a well-developed financial system, it seems that what matters most is the certification. Then we find that indeed, the certification and cash prize have a different effect depending on the startup's technology. And we argue that there are reasons behind it. The first one is that certification seems to have more impact on startups in which, in sectors that experts are good at screening. And it makes sense. Basically, the certification is telling them this group of experts thinks that this startup is good or this startup has less potential. So for that to have an impact on entrepreneurs and investors, this judgment needs to be accurate. The more accurate the judgment of the evaluation of the judges, the more the certification can have an impact on both entrepreneurs and investors. If the certification seems to not be so accurate, then it makes sense that it will have less impact. And second, it seems that even if on average the cash price does not seem to be that important, it can still have an effect, a short-term effect, on startups with low enough running cost. It can allow them to survive a bit longer, and this might help them find more information about whether their startup is worth investing time into it or not. So finally, how do we test the robustness of our results? We want to have alternative identification strategies that do not rely so much on this grade variable to deal with treatment heterogeneity. So what we do is that we estimate an RDD that uses the sharp discontinuity in treatment between the startup ranked 4th, the first winner, and the startup ranked 5th, the first loser. As you can maybe already see, this is less useful in stages 2 and 3 when there's only 2 startups on each side of the cutoff and then only 1. And this is the main reason why we don't use an RDD as our main specification. Then we also do a propensity score matching. And because we recognize that the grades qualities seem to differ a bit, we want to be able to control for that. And we use an error in variable regression analysis that allows for the quality to be observed imperfectly, but in particular for the ICT grades to be relatively less reliable than the science-based grades. I will quickly go over our RDD to convince you further that we actually captured what we say we do. And so here I show you different baseline covariates. So whether startups is an ICT, the gender of its founder, whether the startup is linked to the EPFL or not, depending on their rank in the competition. You can see that for all of those baseline covariates, but for all of them, the startups ranked 4th and 5th seems to have similar probability of being ICT or being linked to the EPFL. However, once you look at the outcome variable, there seems to be a clear discontinuity in survival and funding probabilities at the cutoff. So this is why we use an RDD analysis. Quickly, here you can see in the first line the effect of winning stage 1 for ICT startup, and you can see that it has no effect once more. And then here you see the differential effect on science-based startups if they won stage 1. And you can see that here the effect is significant. And so basically all of our alternative approaches, be it RDD or the others, confirm that only science-based startups benefit from winning stage 1, and only ICT startups seem to benefit from winning stage 3. So a quick summary of our results. In a well-developed financial system, it seems that venture competition are useful mainly because they provide an informative certification of quality. This certification accelerates the termination of low-quality startups, and it improves the external funding opportunities for high-quality startups. Just a quick reminder, winning stage 1 increased the probability of receiving funding within the next 2 years by 14 percentage points. However, the competition did not affect all technology types equally. Startups in sectors where quality could be more objectively assessed enjoyed a long-term benefit from the certification effect. And in contrast, startups with low running costs and whose quality is a bit harder to evaluate only benefit temporarily from having received a cash prize. And these findings could help inform the design of venture competition, how to best create juries. If you want your certification to be useful, then you should make sure that the jury's grading is accurate. And then again, the cash prize, you have to be aware that it's going to be helpful only in some scenarios. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to Michael's discussion.